Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I want to take a look at an article, or rather a book chapter, by the philosopher John McDowell. Now McDowell is a fairly well-known philosopher and he's most famous for his book Mind and World. But this chapter is from much later. It's from a 2008 book called Disjunctivism, Perception, Action, Knowledge, which was edited by Fiona McPherson and Adrian Haddock. And McDowell contributed one chapter, and the chapter is called, it's quite a mouthful, it's called The Disjunctive Conception of Experience as Material for a Transcendental Argument. Okay, well what does that mean? What is he going to do? Well, what McDowell is going to do is he is going to take three philosophical ideas and he's going to bring them together. He's going to take the idea of a transcendental argument. He's going to take the idea of the disjunctive conception of experience. And he's going to take the idea of external world skepticism. Okay, so transcendental arguments, the disjunctive conception of experience, and external world skepticism. And he's going to bring them together by taking the disjunctive conception of experience as material for a transcendental argument that can defeat, is maybe a big word, but that can undermine external world skepticism. So that's the idea. We're gonna give a transcendental argument using the disjunctive conception of experience to undermine external world skepticism. And that's roughly the first four sections of McDowell's paper. And after those first four sections, there's a very long fifth section in which McDowell gives a detailed answer to a paper by Crispin Wright. And I'm not going to go into that. Right? I didn't read Crispin Wright's paper. We didn't read it together. It's not the most useful part of the paper, of the chapter, for our purposes. So I'll focus on sections 1 to 4. All right. How am I going to do that? Well, let's follow McDowell's lead a little bit. And first talk about transcendental arguments, then about external world skepticism, and then about disjunctivism. And I'll explain quite a bit more about skepticism and disjunctivism than McDowell does, assuming that his readers already know that. And then we'll see how McDowell brings them together. So let's start with the idea of a transcendental argument. McDowell actually isn't too interested in exactly how Immanuel Kant, from whom transcendental arguments are supposed to come, how he conceives of transcendental arguments and how he uses them. Rather, what McDowell does in the first section of his paper is he sets out how transcendental arguments have been understood by Peter Strawson and by Barry Stroud, and he shows that there are two ways, among these two people, there turn out to be in the end, they develop two ways of thinking about transcendental arguments. And then McDowell is going to tell us that he is actually going to develop a transcendental argument of a third kind. Now, what all of those kinds of transcendental arguments have in common is that they start with an observation about our experience, how we experience the world, and then they look for something that makes it possible for our experience to be that way. So they look for something that makes it possible for our experience to be that way, to be the way it is. So we have a certain type of experience, and now we start wondering, well, how is it even possible that we have that type of experience? And we try to give an answer to that, and then that answer is supposed to teach us something. In the first kind of transcendental argument, it's supposed to teach us something about what the world is like. In the second type of transcendental argument, it is supposed to teach us something about what our thought necessarily is like, how we have to think about the world. So that's slightly different, or maybe even very different, like showing what the world is like, showing what our thinking has to be like. That's different unless you are Kant and accept transcendental idealism. Then maybe it's not different. But we're not going to go into that in this video. So a transcendental argument then would be an argument that takes some uncontroversial feature of experience, asks, well, how is that feature possible, gives an answer to that, and uses that answer to prove something about the world or about our thinking or about something else. All right, here is how McDowell wants to use it. So McDowell wants to use it against the external world skeptic. Right? The external world skeptic is somebody who thinks that we can't know whether there is a world of objects that are independent of us. Right? So here, let's take this thing, my Nietzsche bust, always here as a prop for my philosophical explanations. So does this Nietzsche bust exist? Well, okay, I mean, sure, it exists, right? But how? How does it exist? I think it exists as an object that's independent of me, right? If I go out of this room, the Nietzsche bust is still there. If nobody is perceiving the Nietzsche bust, it's still there. If all of humanity becomes extinct, the Nietzsche bust is still going to be there, although maybe not for very long. So that's the way that we usually think about objects, right? And the skeptic says, well, maybe, but we can't really know whether that's true. It's also possible that that Nietzsche bust only exists as like mental states, as your subjective consciousness, right? Maybe there's only the idea of the Nietzsche bust internally in your mind, as long as you think about it or as long as you perceive it. And that's it. There are no external objects, right? And this is the familiar kind of skepticism that we know from, let's say, Descartes' meditations. Right, when Descartes suggests that maybe there's an evil demon who deceives us about the world. Or when a more modern philosopher says, well, maybe you're just a brain in a vat. Right, what they're trying to tell us is that there is this possibility that the external world of objects doesn't exist. Or is completely different from what we think we perceive. So, the skeptic has this idea, right? Not just the idea that we might be in a world where there are no really existing external objects. And also not only the idea that we can't be certain about whether we are in a world of really existing objects, but the skeptic is going to have a somewhat stronger worry than that. They're worried that we just can't know. We just can't know, not just not know for certain, but we just can't know whether there are any really existing external objects. And why can't we know that? Well, usually the skeptic is going to tell us this, right? In order to know something, we need to have a reason for it, right? And in this case, a reason would be some type of positive evidence. But, the skeptic says, we can't have any positive evidence. Because here are two scenarios. There's one scenario where you see the Nietzsche bust, right? It's really there. You really perceive the Nietzsche bust. There's another scenario in which you only have this mental state and there is no Nietzsche bust, right? Maybe you are this brain in a vat hooked up to a Nietzsche bust simulator. These two states are indistinguishable from the inside, right? For me, they are just exactly the same. I can't see the difference between them. Well, if I can't see the difference between them, the skeptic says, then whatever evidence I have in one scenario is the same as the evidence I have in the other scenario, right? There can't be an epistemological difference between them. The evidence is the exact same. Well, in the case that I'm just a brain in a vat, the evidence doesn't really involve a Nietzsche bust, right? There is no Nietzsche bust there. And so the evidence in the positive case also doesn't involve a Nietzsche bust, right? Because it's the same evidence. And so my evidence seems to always fall short of the world, right? It doesn't reach out to the world. The world, in a sense, isn't really there in my evidence. And so it seems that, no matter my perceptions, they can never establish a relation to a real world of external objects. And if my perceptions can never establish a relation to a real world of external objects, it becomes really hard to see how I could know that I'm in a real world of external objects. So the claim of the skeptic, and this is extremely important to understand, the claim of the skeptic is not just that somebody who is a brain in a vat is mistaken when he believes that he is in a real world of external objects. Right? Because, yeah, sure, that person is mistaken, but the person who's in the real world is not mistaken. right? And so why worry? At least it seems that the person in the real world knows that they're in the real world, right? They are not mistaken. No, the skeptic says. The fact that the person in the brain in a vat situation has the same evidence as the person who is in the real world, right? They have the same evidence, shows us that this evidence just doesn't justify the belief that you are in a real world of external objects. And so even if you are right that you are in a real world of external objects, you're right based on not enough evidence, right? Evidence that doesn't justify your belief, and that means that you don't have knowledge, right? That's what the skeptic is saying. That's important, because otherwise you don't have skepticism, right? I mean, the fact that you could be mistaken doesn't mean that you don't have knowledge if you're right. Sure, I mean, I could be mistaken, but if I'm right, maybe I have knowledge. No. The skeptic says that there's something wrong with our evidence, right? The evidence never reaches out to the external world. Okay, so this is McDowell's diagnosis of where external world skepticism comes from. It's this idea about evidence. And now we can see, or now we can explain how McDowell's transcendental argument is going to go. It's going to go like this. He is going to point at a feature of experience, namely the feature that experience seems to be of external objects. Or as he likes to say it, it purports to be of external objects. Right? In our experience, like our experience suggests to us, whoa, there are some external objects there, right? That's the nature of the experience. And that's why we want to say, I mean, this is something that the skeptic would usually agree with, right? The skeptic agrees that our experience seems to be of external objects, right? Purports to be about external objects. And that's why the skeptic would say that if you're a brain in a vat, your experience is misleading, right? It's misleading because it seems to be about an external object, but it isn't actually about an external object, right? So this is something that the skeptic and the non-skeptic can usually agree on, that our experience seems to be or purports to be of external objects. Okay, so that's a feature of experience that we can agree on. And now McDowell is going to claim that that can only be true, right? That our experience can only seem to be of external objects or purport to be of external objects if we accept the disjunctive conception of experience. And I'm going to explain what that is later. But let's first see the structure of the argument. So he's going to claim that only if you accept the disjunctive conception of experience can you see how it is even possible for our experience to seem to be of the external world. But the disjunctive conception of experience undermines the argument for skepticism. It doesn't prove that skepticism is false. It doesn't prove that there's an external world, but it undermines the skeptical worry that I have just been explaining to you. This worry that our evidence is always falling short of the world, right? That our evidence never can get out to the world, that it can never be good enough to conclude or to believe that there's a world. So, there's something in experience that we all agree on. Namely, it purports to be of external objects. It seems to be of external objects. That can only be true if the disjunctive conception of experience is true. But if we can only understand it if we accept the disjunctive conception of experience. But if we understand, or if we accept the disjunctive conception of experience, then the argument for external world skepticism that I've just been developing doesn't work. Right? We have to throw it out. Okay, so that would be a kind of transcendental argument. A transcendental argument that takes a feature of experience that we all agree on, we and the skeptic, shows us that we should all be committed to the disjunctive conception of experience, and then shows that this means that we don't have to take skepticism seriously. Right? It doesn't mean that we have proven that skepticism is false, but we've taken away the argument that gave skepticism its weight, right? As long as we agree with the skeptic that our evidence is of such a nature that it can never reach out to the world, then the skeptical worry about the external world seems philosophically important. It's something we need to deal with. But if we don't agree that our evidence can never reach out to the world, yeah, why take skepticism seriously, right? I mean, it doesn't seem to be the kind of... I mean, everybody can always come up with some bizarre worry, right? Everybody could always say, well, maybe all human beings you've met are actually lizards in disguise. How do you know for certain that they're not? You're like, yeah, okay. I mean, that doesn't seem to be a philosophically pregnant worry, right? And you can't disprove all these skeptical scenarios that people can just come up with, because there are infinitely many you can just come up with, and you can make them arbitrarily hard to disprove, right? If I say, well, but those lizards are really good at disguising themselves as humans, right? I mean, not even an autopsy will show, well, you see how it works. So the fact that somebody can come up with a skeptical worry doesn't mean that we have to be worried. But if the skeptical worry comes from a place that we have to agree with, right? If it comes from an insight into the nature of evidence, for instance, if the skeptic can show us, well, evidence always falls short of the world, and we're like, yeah, you're right, evidence always falls short of the world, okay, then we're worried, right? Then we're worried about how we ever get to the world. That's a real worry, a philosophically pregnant worry. So here's what McDowell says about that, and this is at the very end of section 2. He says, if we can recapture the idea that it is so much as possible to have environmental states of affairs directly presented to us in perceptual experience. So he says, if we can recapture the idea that when I'm seeing something, I'm really seeing that thing, right? I'm really seeing the external object. Then we can recognize that such ground rules, the rules of skepticism really, reflect a misconception of our cognitive predicament. Right? So he says, well, the idea that I first have to show that skepticism is false before I can know anything, that makes sense if I think that I can't get in touch with the world. But if I recapture the idea that I can get in touch with the world in perception, then the worry about skepticism sort of goes away. And then our practice of making and assessing claims to environmental knowledge on particular occasions can proceed as it ordinarily does, without contamination by philosophy. Now that's a real McDowell phrase. Without contamination by philosophy, right? The philosophers aren't doing anything good. They're creating worries, and our task as philosophers is to take them away again so that, normal thinking and reasoning can proceed without contamination by philosophy. Alright, so how does this work, this transcendental argument? Well, I've talked at some length about what a transcendental argument is. I've talked about how external world skepticism works. And now we need to talk about the disjunctive conception of experience. Disjunction, that means or, right? That's the disjunction. A disjunctive phrase is P or Q. The disjunctive conception of experience is named for the fact that it separates experiences into two quite radically different kinds. So the disjunctive conception of experience says, well, look, there are two types of experience. There's the kind of experience where you are really in touch with an object, and there's the kind of experience where you're not really in touch with an object, and they have to be understood in radically different ways. So the skeptic claimed they have to be understood in the same way. Right? The skeptic said, okay, we have the exact same evidence. A brain in a vat and a person in the real world have the exact same evidence. Right? You have to understand these two situations in the same way. There's the same evidence, except that maybe this evidence is caused in a different way, but it's not part of the evidence how it's caused. The disjunctive conception of experience says, no, look, when you see a real Nietzsche bust, you are in a situation where you are in direct contact with this Nietzsche bust, right? It's there. It's part of your experience. So your experience is partly constituted by the Nietzsche bust itself. The Nietzsche bust itself, you could say, is part of your evidence. If you're a brain in a vat, there's no Nietzsche bust there, right? So it's it's not part of your experience, it's not part of your evidence. So your evidence is completely different. Doesn't mean that you know that your evidence is completely different or that you can tell the difference between these two types of evidence, but it is completely different, right? Because in the one case, in the good case, you're in touch with a Nietzsche bust. And in the bad case, there's nothing there, right? You're in touch with a computer model or something like that, but you don't even recognize it as a computer model. So the disjunctive conception of experience says we have to analyze these two cases in a different way. And if we analyze these two cases in a different way, then this skeptical worry can't really arise, because you don't have the same evidence in these two cases. And it's not true that having evidence is always going to fall short of being in touch with the world. Because in the good case, you are in touch with the world. Your evidence is a relation to the world, you could say. So the skeptic, again, let's think about this very carefully. The skeptic had to create their skeptical worry, not by pointing out that there are scenarios in which you would be wrong, but by pointing out that even in the good scenario, your evidence seems to be pretty bad. Because even in the good scenario, your evidence is the same as the evidence of the brain in a vat, and that means that the evidence doesn't reach out to the world. And that means that you can't ever reach out to the world cognitively, right? You're in trouble. What the disjunctive conception of experience says is they said we refuse to believe that the evidence is the same, right? In the good scenario, the evidence reaches out to the world. In the bad scenario, it doesn't. So people in the good scenario have different evidence, better evidence, and there's nothing wrong with saying that they know that a world of external objects exist. Okay, so that's how the disjunctive conception of experience can work against external world skepticism. Now, McDowell still needs to do one more thing, right? McDowell needs to show that the disjunctive conception of experience is required for us to understand how our experience can seem to be about an external world. So how can we argue for that? Well, here's maybe the idea that we can. McDowell brings in Sellers in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. Sellers there spends a lot of time thinking about when we can say that something seems to be the case. When we want to say things like, well, it looks as if, blah blah blah. And Sellers argues that that kind of talk, this seems or looks talk, is derivative from like the factual is talk. Right? We first need to understand what it means to say that things are red before we can talk about what it is for something to only look red or seem to be red or something like that. But maybe we can phrase the thought also in a slightly different way. Right? Suppose that the skeptic is right. Right? Suppose that the skeptic is right that our evidence always falls short of the world. It's just some internal mental play. Well, if it's just some internal mental play, right? I just have some conscious states, and they don't have anything to do with the world. They always and necessarily fall short of reaching out to the world. It's just something internal of which I'm aware. Why on earth would it seem to be the case that I'm aware of something external? I mean, where does that idea even come from? It doesn't really seem to make sense. Right? I mean, the only thing that would seem to make sense is to say, oh, look, I'm aware of these things in my mind. That's it. Right? And of course, I am aware of these things in my mind on this picture, and it's always right. I mean, the brain in a vat is just as right about that as I am. And the whole question about the external world doesn't even seem to come up. I mean, why am I even bringing this in as a kind of hypothesis? Why would I even care? I mean, how does this thought even come up? And so what we might think is that in order for it to even be the case that experience seems to be about an external world, it has to be the case that experience, at least in good situations, brings us in contact with actual external objects. Right? Only if good or lucky or perfect experience brings us in contact with an actual external object does it make sense to say that experience seems to be or purports to be of external objects. And so what McDowell wants to suggest is that the very fact that our experience purports to be about external objects only makes sense if we are willing to accept a conception of experience on which, at least in the good cases, it actually does bring us in contact with external objects. Right? If it couldn't do that, if it's a necessary fact about experience that it doesn't bring us in contact with external objects, how could it look, how could it seem to do that? Right? That just doesn't really seem to make sense. And so we now have the complete transcendental argument. Right? We all agree that our experience seems to be about external objects. But experience can only seem to be about external objects if, at least in the good case, it actually is about external objects. Right? It actually does bring us in touch with external objects. But we can only believe that if we accept the disjunctive conception of experience, and not the skeptic's original conception of experience. And so we have to accept this disjunctive conception of experience in order to make sense of our experience. And once we accept the disjunctive concept of experience, the skeptical argument no longer works. Right? Because the skeptic can no longer say that the person in the real world and the brain in a vat have the same evidence. They don't have the same evidence. The person in the real world has experiences that involve, a part of which is an external object. And the brain in a vat does not. They just have different experiences. They just have different evidence. Even if they might not be able to tell the difference. So, that's the story that McDowell wants to tell. If you want to make sense of the idea that we experience the world as if it is external objects, you need to agree that in the good cases we actually do get in contact with external objects. But if you agree with that, then the skeptics claim that the epistemic situation of the brain in a vat and the epistemic situation of the real world person are identical no longer works. Right? Because no, the person in the real world is actually in contact with real objects. The brain in the vat isn't. That's an epistemic difference because that's part of what their evidence or experience is. And so the skeptical argument doesn't go through. It's fairly technical, right? I mean, this is not an easy argument that you can explain in 3 minutes, I'd say, to someone on the internet who has not delved into these ideas. I needed 30 minutes. I do happen to believe that it's fairly strong. If you really think about external world skepticism, and once you see that it's not just like some random worry that we might be mistaken, but that it has to be based on a real philosophical conundrum, on a real philosophical puzzle about the nature of experience or evidence, then this sort of McDowellian story, or Kantian story, because it's in fact a fairly Kantian story, I think, it really makes things a lot more difficult for the external world skeptic. And perhaps they have some kind of retort or way to come back from this, but this certainly generates a puzzle for the external world skeptic, who will now have to argue that they don't have to accept disjunctivism and can still make sense of the idea that our experiences seem to be of external objects. Thank you for listening.